Hello, and welcome to Reflections. I'm Rom Gayoso, your host. So, first and foremost, thank you so very much for your being here with me, my guest today. I know your time is very important, and I am the guy who will make sure it is invested wisely. So, today we have two very special guests, and I'm sure it will be a very fun show. Our topic today is imagining, or rather, reimagining the world around us. And I asked two thinkers to help us with this task. So one uses speculative fabulation, and the other uses speculative fiction. So, what in the world is that? Well, stay tuned and you will find out. Okay, well, everybody's got some rules. And before I get started with the show proper, I need to cover some rules. So let's talk a little bit about those. So, as a quick reminder, if you're here and live with us, please be attentive to social media platforms' rules regarding the use of chat. Please remember to be nice, polite, and courteous. We all come from different backgrounds and we have different perspectives. So, what is really important is to ensure the discussion is civil. And one more thing, absolutely no hate speech is allowed. So, by the way, the chat boxes are open. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the chat. It's called a chat box or a chat window. So, depending on the service you're using. So, please do say hi and let me know where you're watching us from. For our podcast listeners and those watching us via Futures Television, please drop a comment on our YouTube page and I will make sure to acknowledge you. If I appear not to be looking directly at you at the screen, it is exactly because I'm scrolling through the comment boxes trying to read what are you saying exactly. So if you could, please type hashtag ask, and that is hashtag ASK in front of your question. So this way I can immediately spot your question and pose it to the guests. There are several ways for you to submit a question. Of course, you can use the chat if you're online here live with us. You can email me a question. So please email it to editor@imcimagazine.com. Or if you prefer to use the talk to text function, just text your question to 001 for the United States, 480 544 8372. So privacy rules do apply. I will not save your text. I will not save your number. Once it is read, it is deleted. Okay, so let's move on with the first order of business. It is, of course, our agenda for today. So we're going to go through a short introduction. I have two guests today, Zhen Goh from Singapore and Chris Bramley, who is joining us from the UK. We have several opportunities for you to make comments and ask questions. Towards the end of the show, I set aside a little bit of more time. If you have that last minute burning question or comment, there's an opportunity or an extra opportunity for you to talk. Or, of course, you can leave your comments and questions at the YouTube page and we'll get back to it. And then at the end, I will talk a little bit about the upcoming events or the other shows. All righty, so let's move on to the introduction. So Reflections, we are the live stream partner of IMCI Magazine. You can find us online at www.imcimagazine.com. We are an online publications in the United States under registry 2769-0008. We are a member of Idevas America Media. Our focus is on intelligence, so competitive intelligence, market intelligence, economic intelligence, and about a good chunk of the magazine is about foresight and future studies. Of course, our vision is to bring diverse perspectives and voices to the debate. And what you see on the right-hand side of this picture is the cover of our most recent issue. And the focus of that issue is on openness and on inclusivity. Okay, so I want to say a few words about the topic of the show today. So, we indeed live in a period of time marked by great uncertainty, and we face a variety of challenges. So, from climate crisis to societal debate over our rights and even our civil liberties. So, as business people, we often need to better understand the product usage models, and we need to better understand those user stories better and faster than our competition does, right? So, in other words, we are in a state of flux where we need to reinvent or reimagine ourselves, our products, and the way we relate to each other, right? So, today I have two guests who are experts at imagining or creating those worldviews where your products and services will be most successful. So, this imagination skill is one we cannot go without. So, I invite you to hear their message, understand how they account for different perspectives, and explore their thought process. Well, I guess you get the idea. So let me pull a little bit of information. I'm going to introduce my first guest. So Zhen Goh, she's a futurist, speaker, storyteller, and author. She's a director at the Imaginarium in Singapore, and she'll be talking about using sense making and speculative fabulation to reimagine the world around us and to help us better deal with uncertainty. So, without further ado, let me welcome Jen to the show. Hi, Jen. How are you? Welcome to the
Hi,
show.
Rom. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I know it's we're talking at weird hours of the day because we are in different corners of the world. Well, the world does not have any corners; it's round, but we are in so many different time zones. First and foremost, I hope I didn't botch the introduction too much, but if you would like to say a few more words about yourself, that would be great.
No, thanks a lot, Rom. That was a great introduction. I guess to add to that, it's always interesting for me to speak in these kinds of more business orientated settings because I'm actually an anthropologist by training. And I recall when I was in school and my parents asked me what I wanted to do, and I told them I wanted to do anthropology, and they told me I'd never get a job. So it's been fascinating to actually enter into this world and bring in this concept of human evolution, human imagination into the business world, and to actually now, because of the world opening up, we see businesses valuing skills like curiosity more than certainty and technicalities. So it's an exciting time, so thanks for having me.
Wonderful, so great to have you. And a couple of people are saying hi to you. I have Hafdiz Abdulaziz from beautiful Kuala Lumpur saying hi. I have Aja Aslam from San Francisco, and I have Kai Gerlich from Germany. So we have KL, San Francisco. We have Dr. Katindi Sivi. Hello, good to see you, Katindi. She's dialing or calling in from Kenya, Africa. So today we have a worldwide audience. I guess we're not covering Antarctica, but next time perhaps we'll find some penguins or someone to talk to us from there. So I want to pose. So my first question to you is: I would really like the audience to get to know you as a writer
Mhm.
and as a thinker. So you actually wrote a piece titled "Being Woman and Middle Class in Singapore." Well, I know I go everywhere with my questions, but to what extent do you believe your experience in Singapore, and more specifically, how traditional Confucian values permeate through your work or somehow influence it?
No, wow. You really did deep, deep, Rom. I have to say, I forgot that I wrote that. Uh, so it was an interesting period of time in my work because at that point in time, I was studying the culture of intimacy in Singapore. And at that point, we were going through a period where Singapore was already sort of modernized, but we had, I think, been culturally still quite traditional. And we were slowly evolving beyond the traditional scripts of intimacy. And intimacy is one of those really interesting things because it's deeply personal, because you actually use your scripts of intimacy to couple, and then to start families, to actually build, the blocks of society, for example. The government was very interested in understanding, why are divorce rates going up? How are people coupling because you're not doing it in the traditional way anymore? So that study was really about understanding the evolving script of intimacy and how people are actually shifting relationships beyond traditional sort of, man and a woman getting married and then starting a family. It's very interesting because that actually evolved into another piece of work where I was working with sex workers. So it was a very interesting period of time in my life because I was dealing with things that are traditionally internal, kept behind closed doors, and I was able to speak to people about it. And one of the things that came up for me, I was very obsessed with studying Craigslist ads at that time. So this is, gosh, about 15, 18 years ago now that Craigslist was widely used. And, I was fascinated with the personals because, people were seeking partners in the personals. And most of the time, when you read through the personals and, I was going through them thematically, they had this thread where it was, this is my background and these are the traumas that I've been through. So I'm looking for a partner who is similarly sort of broken and then healed like me. So it was a very interesting sort of evolution, and that particular study led me to realize, and a lot of the evolution in my thinking now um, has shifted more towards a Taoist perspective, where with Confucianism, it tends to have a deeply structural, hierarchical type of approach, where you do believe that there is some kind of a leader structure that you follow. Somebody takes care of somebody else, and I'm not saying that that's not true, but the reality is often more dynamic and complex. And then I realized that. Taoism is actually a much more applicable and complex, coherent type of Asian philosophy to follow because it takes into account natural flows, and it's the common saying that water always finds its level. So it's not that people weren't getting together; they were just getting together differently because the times had called for different means of coupling. The script had shifted.
Wonderful. A few people are saying hi. So Fernando
Mhm,
Gutierrez from Florida, our good friend Paul Santilli is saying hi as well.
mhm.
And Joyce Joyce is a great friend, and she actually has a very interesting question. So, why is it that people were not having more children in Singapore, particularly? What did you find?
uh, Besides the cost of living. But interestingly enough, I think that, again, this was close to 20 years ago now. Um, what we've actually discovered is that it's not that people aren't having children, they're actually having them much later on in life. So it was an interesting demographic shift because we were concerned that we weren't replacing the population. And then there were immigration policies, of course. All of these things come together, they conflate, to see if we needed to open up immigration to replace the workforce. And then we did for some time, and then we realized that women were just having children later on in life. And then we had to adjust. So it's one of those interesting things. But at the current rate, we're still not 100% replacing ourselves. But it's definitely not that we're not having children. Uh, there's also interesting debate because one of our founding fathers, Lee Kuan Yew, a very respected man, he was once criticized, I think, for saying that he regrets championing that women should go and have university education, should also get jobs. Most of us work, we're brought up to work as opposed to being brought up to actually have a family. And he said that that might have been one of his biggest mistakes. I thought that was interesting.
kind of shocking, I guess, but okay. So I want to continue on our talk on the Confucian values or traditional Confucian values, and two of them. One is harmony, and the other one is wisdom, and those two come to mind. So it seems not just here in the West, but also in the West, we have fallen into a situation of total disharmony with nature. So which manifests in or embodies in our current climate crisis we're enduring, right? So do you think, therefore, if we embrace such values, would they help us refocus our attention on the climate, or do you think that they are too alien, at least here in the West, to be useful? So, in a sense, I'm asking you, what's the value of Confucian values?
Mm. Um, I think that Confucianism has different names in different cultures. I don't think that the values are unique to the Chinese culture or tradition. I think that there are guises of Confucianism across many different cultures. So there isn't any culture that sort of doesn't y- emphasize the importance of some kind of harmony, some kind of respect across different generations, respect across different people. And even actually, interestingly enough, because I am part of the diaspora, right? I'm only second generation Singaporean. My grandfather came direct from China. So I'm actually, it's interesting for me because China went through the Cultural Revolution, and their um, their incorporation of the Confucian values and their traditionalism is potentially less entrenched than mine, because as the diaspora, I left before, or my ancestors left before the Cultural Revolution, right? And we have a very different appreciation of Confucian values as opposed to how they understand it in China. They have some embracing of it still, in their family structures, in the way they respect the state, but I think that the diaspora understands it differently. They're a lot more entrenched in really heritage culture, belief in Chinese religion, as opposed to, again, in China, where with the Cultural Revolution, religion was not as strongly entrenched. And I think let's take that argument to the West, right? And I know we use East and West, but I feel that they're very loose terms, because even within the U.S., for example, which is between the East and the West of the U.S., you have something like a 900-year history difference. So I'm using these terms loosely again. I think that there isn't actually a lot in Christian values, for example, that we can't draw commonalities to Confucianism through. Um, I actually think that in terms of, again, this embracing of the climate, of trying to address these kind of issues of sustainability, a more organic approach, again, moving away from this highly structured, believing that there is order in everything. We actually need to embrace the unorder of things, that you cannot gain mastery over everything, that you actually do have to coexist, and you have to watch the patterns of the system and then respond to them. Again, it's an almost embracing of more naturalistic approaches, which Confucianism, interestingly enough, I don't think is. It's still got this very strong layer of human structure that and order that's been overlaid onto it.
Great perspectives. Thank you so much for sharing your views. It's always interesting because we tend to see, at least in thoughts process, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore aligning closer because they didn't have the Cultural Revolution and what else was imposed on the Chinese on the mainland. Now, I need your help. So let's talk a little bit about sense making. Can you help us make sense of sense making? So, what is sense making, and how is it important?
So, my colleagues and I, we have this little reading group, which is precisely called that, making sense of sense making. And we actually gave ourselves a challenge, which is, can we define sense making without using the words sense and making? Um, and so we thought about it, and I think the way that we came about it is actually how people navigate and orientate in this world with the massive amounts of patterns and novelty and signals that we receive. How do we actually digest and then orientate and then come together and create new meaning from that? So I think without using those two words, that's how I would sort of explain it. But if I were to remove that restriction on myself, then I think that sense making is really about understanding the world with all of its patterns, all of its signals, all of its novelty, understanding how it is that we process that, how we make sense of new patterns, new signals, so that we can actually um, exist and take action. Because human beings, again, are actually pattern processors. We're very good at processing patterns. A lot of the cognitive science tells us that we function on this pattern satisficing perspective. So that is, when I see a novel signal, I find the pattern that most closely relates to that in my mind, and I match it. And that's actually, on a very basic level, how I make sense of things. I match the patterns. So if, for example, I'm crossing the road in Antarctica, which I've never been, I'm assuming there's not much vehicles there, but I won't be able to cross the road. I won't be able to jaywalk with as much ease as I would in New York City, for example, where everybody jaywalks. I've been there enough. I know how to do it, because I don't have the patterns to match to it. And culturally, when you come into a new community, the traffic systems are different. The culture of whether people stop for pedestrians are different. How assertive you have to be are different. So it's really about pattern matching. So I think a lot of the work that we do is actually helping people to recognize the value of having a diversity of patterns, of not only patterning in a specific way, but actually expanding your diversity of patterns, expanding your diversity of ability to match. And that's how we're better able to handle things like strategic surprises or novelty, because the more patterns you have, the better an assemblage you can form in your mind when something doesn't quite match up to what you're used to.
Okay, so let's change a little bit. That takes care of sense making. So, what is speculative fabulation?
Uh, so this term I love. It's actually drawn from a thinker that I very much respect. Her name is Donna Haraway. So she comes from a school of UC Santa Cruz feminist thinkers. Her most famous work is probably Cyborg Manifesto, and a lot of her work is really in forcing us and challenging us to think. So she actually puts into mind, or she puts a lot of provocations out through bricolage. So she puts a lot of unrelated things, concepts, things together. And that's why Cyborg Manifesto is, where she describes the cyborg as actually quite an interesting thing. It's part human, part machine. And she actually utilizes that as a metaphor for the world that we're in. Now, Speculative Fabulation is a later publication, and it's really about this new mode of thinking and worlding. So there's she one of my favorite quotes is, she says, "It matters what thoughts we use to think other thoughts with, what knots we use to knot other knots with." So it's really about how we're actually compositioning of our world, how we're actually putting things together in our mind. And because we're so used to certain things, we take them for granted. We actually stop sort of pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible. So she uses this word fabulation. And if you were to go and listen to some of Donna Haraway's interviews, she says that she's quite specific in using fabulation, and she prefers the French fabulation because it's really about the fabulous. It's about potential fables, it's about pushing things, it's about pastiche, it's about bringing things that are not currently related and entangling them in new ways. So for me, speculative fabulation from a futures perspective is particularly useful. And I think I'd love to hear from Chris later on. It's not so different than speculative fiction in that it really is pushing the boundaries. But speculative fabulation, I think, is a bit more accessible because I think fiction, insofar, has been seen as the realm of writers, where they have to build this fabulous worlds that go along with it. To her, speculative fabulation is something that we should engage in for the everyman, and she actually challenges us on a day-to-day level to think differently. So, for example, she says that the world at the moment, to go back to your provocation earlier, Rom, about climate change, is actually overly human centered. She said, what if we actually thought about a more human and coupled with animal centered world? What if we thought about pigeons, for example? We dismiss them as flying rats, for example, right? But pigeons are actually a species that has really learned to exist in the human world. And what if we actually thought about building an urban environment with the pigeon in mind? What would that look like? So she's really challenging us to push the contextual boundaries of how we're compositioning of the world.
So perhaps the pigeons would demand more squares, which perhaps would be good for us. More squares for the pigeons to fly around and not being nice because they do other things other than flying around. But again, so how are the two linked? So sense making and speculative fabulation, how
Mm.
are they linked, or how do they work together?
Uh, so again, I think why I'm drawn to speculative fabulation is because she says it's really about your everyday worlding. It's really about how you're making sense of the world, where you're drawing your contextual boundaries, and then rethinking what sits within that. Uh, so in that piece that I wrote for the magazine, Rom, I talk about this concept of context and how everyone now is, saying, and they acknowledge context is so important, context over content. But one of the things that I've recognized and realized when I work with our partners and our clients is they don't actually know what constitutes of context. Context is actually hard to conceive of because you're sitting in it. Um, and I got very fascinated with the word context. So because I also speak Mandarin, I went and there are some issues with the limits of the English language. I think there are wonderful things about it because the language constantly evolves. But for all of its evolution, I think it lacks a little bit of description. So I went and looked at the different translations of context in Chinese. The most commonly used ones in business is actually I'll use the Chinese version and then I'll translate it. It's a 上下文中, which literally translates into what's up and what's down and what's within the text. But the funny thing is there are like 4 or 5 other ways to translate it. And my favorite one is actually it literally translates into what has come before, what is about to come after, and then the environment that it's swimming within. Now, if we think about that as sort of the way contextually we use to define things, it is about really framing in a more dynamic way. So I started to study again the differences between because so much of language and so much of what we do and the way that we conceive of the world is limited by our language. Um, I started to look at art, which is the foundations of language. And there is very beautiful art from the Renaissance, the period of Enlightenment, where people started really to play with very strong linear construction. So if you look at a lot of art from that era, they use linear construction lines. Everything is beautiful, it's symmetrical, it's done to scale, right? Whereas if you look at again, my point of reference is Asian art. You realize that they're distorted, they're not exactly done to scale. It's not a single perspective. So in more traditional Western art, they use linear construction lines. You either use a single point of view or dual points of view, and then you use construction lines mapping back to those viewpoints. And if you think about that as how we're framing and how we're sense making and how we're world making, using anchors, there is a single construction line or dual sort of anchors within a Western piece of art. Whereas if you look at traditional Asian art, I don't know if you recall, you'll see in some of these museums, right, these rolling scrolls that they used to make, map makers used to make, right? And they literally roll, they scroll along. And if you think about it, it's actually the very first motion picture, because the way you're supposed to utilize that map is to hold a glass up to it and roll the map along. So you can see the emperor in one frame, and then 2 frames later you see the emperor again, because it's supposed to be moving. And the lines are not linear construction lines. The perspective is actually 3 or 4 fold, so you see people from different points of view. That's what they refer to as an axonometric view, which is starting to become really popular in architecture. And that's when I realized that, again, from a sense making perspective, speculative fabulation forces us to push our contextual boundaries and to actually see beyond the linear construction lines that we're so used to, because so much of Western philosophy and the knowledge we've developed has come from the Enlightenment, this wave of rationalism. How do we actually push our contextual boundaries beyond rationality? Because a lot of what, and from futurist thinking, we're aware is actually not about just what's possible or what's probable. It's the thing that you thought was completely impossible, and that's what actually takes you by surprise if you don't expect it. So that, to me, I think is the interesting link between sense making and speculative fabulation, because speculative fabulation forces us to frame in a much broader way and to actually see from across multiple perspectives and to blend perspectives as well.
Wonderful. So before I move into more questions, I have to take care of one more definitional question, because I think it's important for the audience that we kind of name things and get your perspective on them. I actually asked Chris this exact same question, but how different or similar are speculative fabulation and speculative fiction? So fabulation versus fiction, and how are they used in business? So the business use similarities and use.
Mm. Um, this is my, of course, my perspective. I think that speculative fiction, and I'm very geeky. I follow a lot of these series and I read them from end to end. It is often a feat of imagination, as in there is very comprehensive world building that goes into it. There are story arcs, right, that are completed. uh, I think that it's very useful in imagining the future for businesses, and I know a lot of businesses who utilize, the the help of science fiction authors to imagine the future for them. I know, Rom, you've had interviews with others in this series who have talked about that. I think speculative fabulation is really a much more humble undertaking, so it involves in some kind of worlding as opposed to world building. So I'm consistently reworlding. So I'm rethinking the boundaries on an ongoing basis. So I think that science fiction gives us a longer arc, whereas speculative fabulation is really about smaller, shorter arcs, and casting around us on an ongoing basis.
Wonderful. We have now that we have the definitions, I think we can start dancing around them. So one thing is Joyce was saying it's very important, and I like your work on speculative fabulation because say, well, if you look at different perspectives, and what I like about your work is we mentioned not just the pigeons and other things like that, but you include voices that are often neglected or otherwise not included. And Joyce was highlighting, well, we do kind of only think about the world in our own perspective. I guess we're only one of the species, and Joyce is pointing out we're one of the, right? But we can only imagine the world as seen by us, and perhaps there are more ants than there are people, and they think about a world very differently from the way we do. Paul has a question. So how do you reconcile uh, blurring of existing meanings and interpretations with speculative fabulation against that of data-driven truths and facts? So fabulation, fact versus fabulation.
Um, I think that imagination is a strange thing. Uh, so it's very often difficult for us to shake off the shackles of reality. That's what I found. Even when you tell a truth, there is a way that we're telling it. There is a a frame or some kind of a structure of story that it's told in. You've chosen what to convey, but in choosing what to convey, you've also left things out. And I don't think it's deliberate, right? It's simply the way that we have to create some kind of parameters to convey something. I think that it's not necessarily difficult to reconcile because a lot of the work that we do actually starts from data, right? We collect information, we collect data, but we're very conscious that we need to use multiple modalities, multiple methods, and include a diversity of perspectives and diversity of sources. And speculative fabulation is simply recognizing that the world is not the same thing for everyone. There is great asymmetry in experience, there is great asymmetry in information, there is great asymmetry in the interpretation of that. And I think speculative fabulation is actually not so far divorced from data driven truths and facts. In fact, what we found is it is this over sort of over reliance or over, very strong belief that we can be 100% factual or 100% accurate about things that are in constant evolution, that are uncertain, that we actually need to fight against, because that gives us this illusion of assurance, illusion of certainty that we all know as we navigate into a world of increasing uncertainty, as COVID has taught us, right? That we can only plan so far ahead. We become aware that illusion is actually more dangerous than casting around on a consistent basis.
Wonderful, and I'm so happy of your background as an anthropologist because we can go many places. So there's a comment here that I wanted to share. So Hafid's actually mentioned that art came before language in human evolution, and if memory serves me right, in your article you actually explained just that one of the marks or traits of evolution is I think you used the ochre or red pigment. So a pigmentation as a way of explaining or showing or evidence of a society or evolution. Can you talk a little bit about that? So, art before language.
Absolutely. So we know from evolution that um, actually we started to paint on walls and convey stories and things that happen to us through these paintings. And that's one of the ways archaeologically we dig to see if there was the presence of human evolution, is to find these wall paintings, red ochre is one of the pigments that occurred very naturally for a very long time. And there is, again, archaeological evidence to show that red ochre was used to color cowrie shells, for example, and that created one of the first types of currency. So a lot of what we do is actually, again, pastiche of layer upon layer of micro meaning and micro meaning, and that's how greater meaning evolves. And art came before language because art was the first way we actually communicated, and then language evolved much later on. Now we know from evolution again that because humans also gathered for a living, right? And in again, a lot of evidence actually suggests that even though we talk about the early men as a hunter, right? That they hunted, they ate a lot of meat. Actually, because we stabilized and were able to evolve to the state that we were because of a very stable climate, which is this particular geological epoch. It's a stable climate, right? It's more likely that we gathered for a living and then we hunted. So the our muscles and the way our cognition evolved was to handle small little seedlings, to pick things, and again, that the cognitive evolution suggests that that moved sideways and allowed us to handle the granularity of vocabulary and grammar and semantics and things like that. So it's very interesting from in an anthropological and evolutionary perspective.
Actually, I want to comment on that because
Mhm.
in your article you explained, well, because we're gatherers before we're hunters, we tend to talk about the spear and the hunter and someone hunting, but in fact you deducted perhaps the first objects we created were like baskets to collect or to put bits and pieces of what we found along the way, but it's not really exciting to talk about a basket, right? So we kind of ignored the basket and went straight to the spear or the shield or whatever. So is that a cultural thing? I mean, perhaps the basket wasn't sexy or appealing. We had to go to the spear and the hunter or killing the beasts. Is that a cultural trait of ours?
Perhaps, I believe so. It's just, it makes for better storytelling. What we also know is that um, as a species, we learn from failure, right? We learn a lot from telling others, hey, that seed killed my husband, don't eat it, it's poisonous, as opposed to celebrating when we have success. So hunting stories are just, I think, more fraught with adrenaline, but I also think that it's cultural because if you look at other myths and fables and cultures, like Hinduism, for example, is one of the oldest religions in the world, and they have the lingam, the phallic structure, right, which is spear like. But they also have the yoni, which is the carrier. I think that, or the receptacle, the receiver. I think that cultures, different cultures, and again, the importance of diversity of perspectives and unfolding in different cultures helps us to balance the perspective. But I do think that the adrenaline helped us to learn better as a species because it imprints when the adrenaline is high.
Wonderful. And I have so many wonderful friends watching us today, and Kai is one of them. And I speak with Kai usually for hours. He posed a question. I will pose the question to you, but only to plant a seed in the back of your mind because I'm going to ask Chris the same question towards the end of our show. But really, his question is so, how do we get to a global consciousness that cares about all living beings? I'm going to save that. I'm not going to pose that now. I want you to think about it and give me an answer towards the end. I'm going to ask so Chris is listening to us as well. I'm going to ask you guys towards the end. I really love those kinds of questions, but I wanted to ask you a different one. So before we can reimagine our reality, we have to basically deconstruct the current one, right? We have to deconstruct the current view to build a new one. So you talk about sense making, but you also talk about sense unmaking. So
Mhm.
what do you mean by sense unmaking?
Hmm. I think, um, again, this is my experience working with partners and clients. Actually, imagining is exciting. Casting into the future, thinking what could be is exciting. And then figuring out what to do to get there. That's what's really intimidating. And that's because they have sunk cost structures and processes and things in place that they don't even know how to begin reworking. So actually, what I found is that the imagination that we can stimulate, but then you get to this hard wall, which is, oh my God, we have to deal with all of the things. The costs of change is so high. This immunity to change is so strong. So that's why, in our work, what I've started to really understand and appreciate is this need to sense unmake, to actually pull away some of the illusions, this really deeply entrenched assemblages that we have in our mind. Things have to be a certain way. The structure is so, we've invested this much, the cost of change is too high. Like, these are the things you typically hear when you're trying to attempt any type of change. And again, if we're speaking about futures and guiding our clients toward a new future, it involves a lot of reworking of their existing systems. So I think sense unmaking is one of the more operational technical bits that we have to deal with when we're actually putting change into motion. So that's why I think that's one of the things I highlighted in the article. Because whilst we sense make and we're very good at making meaning, it comes really naturally to us. It's harder to unlearn or unknow something. You can never unknow something. You can only rework what that means to you. So I think sense unmaking is equally important. And I think, again, I bring in the importance of diversity. The other fabulation that I talk about in the article is this tradition of critical fabulation, which is actually created by a black feminist author, where she said, for example, the black female slave experience was never fully told because there were never any accounts that were written by black female slaves. So her own sort of personal agenda is to rework that, the retelling of those stories. And she says the only way she can do that is by very critically studying a diversity of sources and voices, and from that era she can never tell it from a single perspective. So a lot of again, we see these round tables, these open conferences. It's really about bringing in a diversity of perspectives so that that unmaking can be stimulated in a less intimidating way.
And we're gonna go there too with comments and questions. Folks, I want you to just pause for a second. And when so many of my guests are futurists for a reason, right? So we do talk about personal futures. We talk about in the business context, but the people here. So Shen, for example, plus Kai and Dr. Katindi Singvi, it's not just about business, but about making broad changes. So we tend to focus on personal and business, but you talk or your work is a lot or very focused on policy making, right? So big, broad changes. So using futures, so sense making, speculative fabulation to change policies. So let's go back. I want to talk to you a little bit about policy making. So let's go back to the climate change. I'm sorry I keep going back to this, but I think it's an important topic. So how do you think the use of sense making and speculative fabulation can help policymakers come up with a better path, or at least a more restorative path for us to follow?
um, I think that so I work with different governments, and a lot of them are grappling with issues of things like climate change. A lot of them are also trying to do things like rework their economic systems from their studs, because they recognize that those things are entangled. You can't deal with one without the other. You have to confront a lot of other related topics and aspects. And I think that sense making, again, is our collective and diverse and multiple experiences informing our understanding and navigation of the world in different ways. Uh, and I think what I've also recognized with a lot of the work that I've done with governments in recent years is the rise in the need for citizen engagement, for stakeholder engagement, because they recognize that they can't do it on their own. And a lot of that is, collective sense making, and getting other people's ideas into the door and figuring out it's not just what can we do anew, is what are people doing at the moment right now that's already working, but it just doesn't have enough resources. You know, the work of Mariana Mazzucato is really interesting because she talks about this false divide between private and public. She says that for so long, right, like the private sector has said, "Oh, we don't need the public sector. The regulation is not necessary." And there's this neoliberal rise that has been criticized in recent years that's really come down because in COVID we recognized that good public leadership actually really mattered. So Mazzucato's work talks about the fact that if you study really big innovation that really pushed change forward, technology systems to actually evolve very quickly, it was actually government led. So a lot of the policy now is figuring out how do we build this more generative and reinforcing private sector, public sector, private sector, and civil sector partnerships. How can we bring those voices in? How can we actually cast around for different types of sense making? What are people already doing? Where can we add momentum, add resources? And then also, where does the government need to lead the way? For example, nuclear fusion energy, right? If we really could achieve that, that would be great. But I don't think without the government's help we can do that. So it's again understanding where the balance is, and where are we better leveraging community level sense making, where are we better coordinating collective sense making, and where are we better actually creating constraints and boundaries to allow for specialized private sector things to take place. So a lot of the policy work that I've been involved in recently is around managing those relationships, those boundaries, and those constraints.
Wonderful. And I think you did a wonderful job at explaining things one by one. So now I'm going to make the alphabet soup a little bit and mix them up a little bit and see if they still make sense. I think it's a way for me and for others to make sure we are clear, right? So
Mhm.
we tend to view or relate speculative fabulation with science fiction, adding another word in there. Okay. So, but the applications you were mentioning are non-fiction in nature, right? So, to what extent is it right to say that you are a speculative non-fiction author?
I love that. I just saw this really funny photo today. I guess these guys who own these bookshops have a really good sense of humor. They say we've done a bit of reorganization. Science fiction is now in nonfiction, and um, epidemiology is now in self help, and so it's I don't think a set thing, right? I think that um, the work of speculative fiction, the work of speculative fabulation, is forcing us to confront nonfiction, to confront reality in different ways. And I think your guest, Tom Lombardo, probably could say it so much better than I can. But so much of all the technology that we have today existed because it was dreamt up by someone else 20 years ago. Everyone is talking about VR now. We were just talking before this show started about Oculus glasses, for example, right? And we know that that was imagined years ago in a novel. And in that particular book, the author described people who were hooked onto their VR glasses as gargoyles because the world had become so terrible that they wanted to escape into this virtual reality. And the time that virtual reality took off was COVID, and we couldn't go out, and life seemed, pretty meaningless, right? So I think that fact and fiction are not one or the other. I think they're very much forcing us to confront the other. And I think good science fiction and good speculative fabulation is actually another way to confront reality and help us to rethink the what do we need to change? What do we need to make sure we avoid dystopia, and what are the multiple utopias we need to nudge toward?
Actually, so folks, this line of thought, let's keep it in mind. So using fabulation or speculation or fiction, or our next guest is going to talk a little bit about fantasy as a way to confront reality. That is going to be a theme or a topic that I'm going to keep coming back. So between the two of you, I'm going to ask kind of the same kind of question. So I wanted to address another one, and you coined the term cli-fi. So can climate fiction help us rethink our reality? So how can we help people move from imagination to taking concrete action? Can speculative fabulation do that?
Absolutely. I believe so. Like really cli-fi that I recall, off the top of my mind. I recently read Ministry of the Futures, and I have to say it took me forever to get through the book. Not because the book was bad. I mean, it was a very well written book, but it was because it didn't feel like fiction. It felt like reality, and I was depressed, right? And in the book, the solution that Kim Stanley Robinson took it was a proposition from him was to rework the economy, to come up with a very different way of organizing the economy and the systems of production that come around it. And I was like, that's not fiction. That's needed right now. And again, if you think about the work of people like Mariana Mazzucato or Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, it's confronting it at their very studs. After COVID, the city of Amsterdam reworked its economy around donut economics. So I found it depressing because it didn't feel so far off from where we are. And a lot of the challenges that he spoke about also didn't feel so far off from where we are. But it does help us to consider different realities. Another one is Octavia Butler's work, where she talks about you know, a Los Angeles that has run out of water and everyone migrating north is dystopic. But she says we need to start an earth seed movement where we're starting to be more organic and we work in communes. And actually, you see that happening in different parts of the world, right? A lot of rise of co-ops, community co-ops, land co-ops for farming. It's actually helps us to imagine how it might work for us. And particularly because a lot of these start from some form of dystopia and then rebuilding with the hope that we have left, I think that it helps us to confront again some very real challenges that we're facing right now.
Yes, and actually you mentioned the water rights. Here in the West, there's a constant battle between the four states over water. But the situation became so grave that Arizona actually is returning water because they realize, hey, we're consuming way much faster than it can be replenished. So at least people are waking up. That's good news. So I wanted to kind of go back to one thing you spoke, and I wanted to explore it a little bit further. And I'm going to talk about critical fabulation again, but in greater detail. So I really want to shift the conversation to inclusiveness. As you know, inclusiveness is one of the main reasons why actually I do this work in the magazine and the podcast and the live stream. It permeates all that I do. So in your work, you often mention critical fabulation, right? So, which is indeed an effort to bring those voices that are often forgotten or otherwise marginalized or written off with purpose or with intent, right?
Mhm.
And you seek to include them into the sense making process, right? So, in your view, so what is the value or the importance of designing a sense making process that is indeed inclusive?
Hmm. It's definitely important. You know, for many reasons. First off, often, if we again take policy as an approach, for so long, policy has been designed for everyone who falls under the majority in a normal distribution. That's the reality, right? And then we design exigencies to capture the people at the bottom. And it never works because the people at the bottom are always the underrepresented. They're always minorities, double minorities, and then they become cast as problems. And I think the problem is because the normal distribution and the way we collected representative data was always going to be skewed against them. The system is rigged against the minority groups, against the undervoiced. So, in a lot of the work that we do, particularly in policy, when people ask us how do we sample, I always ask them, who do you really need to hear from? Um, those are the people you should actually actively seek to oversample because you never get enough feedback from them. I think it's not just in sampling, but also in a very genuine, authentic approach. So much of work that we do also tends to come across as extractive. Sometimes we take information, and that's why we're quite deliberate in calling it sense making. It's not research. It's not surveying them. It's not data gathering. It's sense making because the process of sense making means I'm asking you for information, but we will create new meaning together. We'll negotiate meaning creation together. And I think that the combination of that is really critical. And that's critical fabulation is giving the undervoiced voice.
Great. We have a provocative comment here, so I'm gonna pose it to you. So thank you, Haftiz. It's saying what is ironic is that in sci-fi movies, the cities or towns, municipalities, countries, whatsoever, are run by corporations due to the collapse of government from a previous crisis. So is the government, as we see it, a dodo on its way to extinction, or is it some kind of a dystopia that we love to talk about, the end of government?
I think it's one of the dystopias we like to talk about. Uh, I think it's because we genuinely can't imagine a life without government. Because even if there isn't the government, there is a government. And I think that um, a lot of what we've seen in the past few years with a lot of neoliberal beliefs coming to the fore and becoming criticized, we're starting to see that that's not necessarily the way forward. It's really interesting. Joel Balkin's book, The Good Corporation, he writes about that. He writes about how a lot of these collectives come together, private sector, and they talk about how do we run the world better? How can we work outside the failures of government? I think that it's not one or the other. I think it's often so much easier to cast it as opposing sides when it really is a complement, when it really needs to come together and work together. It's a continuum as opposed to this opposing sides type of argument. This binary type of positioning is convenient. It's easy for people to lock into, but it's not particularly helpful. I think again, what COVID has shown us is we good public governance really does make a difference, right? It makes a difference how you distribute aid, how you know I'm let's forget whether people are pro or anti anything, but if there are resources or there are things that need to be done, um, the government takes a very different approach than the private sector in how they organize. And it's not one or the other, right? You need both. We need the private sector, and we need the government, and more than that, we need the civil sector, right? So that's what we also saw a lot of when neither the government nor corporations and what they were doing was enough. Is actually the community started to self-organize, and we need all of that.
So maybe it's a little bit of both, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a different kind of question, and it's something that I know you love to talk about. But let's discuss the art of the possible together. So, how can we go about reimagining the possible, or what is possible, or where do we start?
Mm. I think that again, we do it every night when we go to bed. We dream. Um, we default to it as children. We daydream. um, we see shapes in clouds. I think that we default to it. We see possibility. I think it's really about systematically harnessing that ability to imagine what's possible. And that again is why it's really important to do the right kind of engagement. That's why it's very important to actually be more consultative, which is another trend I think we're seeing a lot of, whether it's in product development, in user requirements gathering, or policy making and citizen engagement. It's about the systematic gathering of possibilities and how they're imagined across the board. I think that the art of the possible is really about, again, recognizing that we can't do it alone. We've got to systematically work together. We have to gather possibilities and then understand how we can mobilize the resources and how we can actually work with the system that we have to achieve them.
Wonderful. So please stick around because I have that last question that's waiting, and I'm gonna talk to both you and and Chris at the same time. So well, thank you so much, and it's always so great to speak with you. Just as a reminder, people, she's a regular contributor to the magazine, and her last article is titled "Speculative Fabulation," and it earned really, really very, very high remarks. So, Jen, thank you so much for being here
Thank
with
you.
us today here.
It was fun.
Okay, so don't go away. I'll go back and ask you more questions. So let's go back to the agenda. So we spoke a little bit with Jen today. I can talk to her for hours. It's okay. And now we have Chris, and Chris is going to be another one that I think we have a lot to ask, and many questions and comments will be appearing. So let me introduce you to Chris. So he is a published author. He is a coach, a TEDx speaker. He's a director at Finding Shores in the UK. And in his coaching business, he advises firms on agility, complexity, and human learning. He is a prolific writer and a storyteller. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about writing compelling sci-fi and fantasy stories. So let me actually welcome him to the show. Hi, Chris. Welcome.
Hi, Ron.
Good to see you.
Yeah,
I hope I didn't do too bad of a job at the intro, but if I missed something, please say a few more words about you.
sure. No, I think you covered some of the basics there. I mean, I'm also people always say I'm a lifelong learner, and it's always very good to kind of have that. But learning is a really deep core thing for me. So I write across multiple genres. I guess it's probably worth mentioning I'm a TEDx speaker as well. So I speak about things like collaboration, which touches on. I mean, obviously, I've met Zen a few times before, more or less, talking about stuff like complexity theory and learning about that from her and others. So that's nice, but it's also good to know quite why I approach things in quite a different way. And it touches on actually quite a few things that you've been discussing. So I'm atypically autistic, and I see the world very differently to a lot of people. I think that's probably a good way to put it. So, yeah.
Great. So actually, first order of business is I wanted the people to, and I think it's important that they get to know you as a writer, right? So, and again, you write on a variety of genres, right? Fantasy, comedy. Actually, yes, I have children's books, comedy, nonfiction, fiction, right? So it's clear that storytelling is one of your many talents, right? Actually, I saw some videos that I could make comments on the other talents, and you're climbing the walls and all sorts of things. You're very talented. But it seems to me one underlying characteristic of your work is this ability to find meaning and actually, foster connections, identify connections. So I'd like to ask you, so how do you see your role? So what is your mission as a writer? So why do you write?
I think there are multiple reasons that I write, and it probably depends on quite what I'm writing about. So in some ways I write because I want to help people understand things. The biggest thing for me, and this is partially an autistic thing, but also just something some people have, which is the seeking of understanding of things. Like, it's really, really super important what truths are out there. And that's something that really, really drives me. But there's also the sharing of things. Like, so one of the things I mentioned in the TEDx, which segues into a lot of what you and Jen were talking about, is that we seek meaning usually through sharing stories. The sharing of stories is essentially where kind of me becomes we, and we can talk about how stories become assemblages and all sorts of things. But the drive behind it is kind of the seeking of meaning and the sharing of meaning. So stories can be used as very factual kind of narratives of events, but they can also be used as parables. They can be used as ways of, subtly giving meaning to other people. So part of it's exploration, part of it's understanding, part of it's sharing, and part of it is a way to also allow flow. Like, flow is a very important thing to me. I mean, I play a few instruments and whatever, not particularly well, I must admit. And there's kind of that idea of the muse for the creative, for the artist. And it's a way of almost exploring how creativity isn't always created and constructed. Sometimes it flows and you're more of a conduit. So all of those things are really important to me.
So I didn't think of you as a musician. So maybe I have to think about more questions about your musical talent. So maybe you should upload some of those videos. So we often talk about the importance of reading, and I wanted to address that specifically with you. So at a very early age, you were exposed to a great variety of fantasy books, and you talk quite a lot about that. Reading about fantasy books at a very early age. So to what extent those immersive realities, or fantasy worlds or fantastic worlds, they really helped mold your personality and mold or help define the writer that you became?
I think that it was fundamental to a lot of what I do and a lot of how I see the world. And I think, again, I was diagnosed autistic fairly late, actually fairly recently. So I knew quite a lot about neurodiversity, and I probably always suspected that there was some there. Quite clearly there is. So for me, one of the most important aspects of it was escapism. I didn't fit anywhere with anyone. And so perhaps I was seeking places where I might fit better, or at least, experience different places where other things could be, the case. So, but there's also the element, and Zen touched on this earlier, which is that the world building element. Like, I'm fascinated by how people can create what isn't, essentially, make these things almost reality that aren't. So it's that idea of bringing in worlds from all of Terry Pratchett's books to kind of stuff like Neil Gaiman, to some of the sci-fi elements, which are almost reimagining the world. And this is where we start that kind of, and I thought this when Zen said it earlier, the fuzzy liminality kind of aspect of between fabulation and fiction. I think there's definitely overlap there. And that it was a way for me to share stories that really mattered. And when I realized that I had a lot of things that I wanted to share, that was when I kind of started thinking, well, actually, I would like to write. So as early as 13, I was writing. I was writing earlier than that, but that's when I really started. And in fact, my first chapter in my kind of main fantasy series is more or less it's slightly better now, but it's more or less unchanged from when I was 14. And that was kind of a homage to my English teacher at the time, who really encouraged me.
Oh, wonderful. So I wanted to address, actually, Zhen made a comment, and actually I want to talk to you about one of your quotes. So you said, there is no failure, only feedback. Real failure comes from ignoring that feedback, and humans learn from failure far more effectively than we do from success. So why is that?
So I think there are two parts to this that are worth addressing. Why we learn so effectively is, I think failure for people is often relatively context-free. Like, what doesn't work for a lot of people, or what people have failed on, is something that other people can certainly learn from, at least. Whereas success, I think, certainly in things like business, is quite contextual. Like, so you can't, as we know, you can't copy paste the success of other people. You can't do the same innovative approaches other people have, because they've already done it. It's already been done. But the failures they've experienced, you can probably learn from. So I think that that's an important kind of aspect of it. But also, there's no failure, there's only feedback. I mean, okay, you can get into the nuances, and this goes into the kind of Cynefin complexity side that, Zhen and I both have kind of looked at in the past, and that's the fact that you can differentiate between catastrophic failure and things that are safe to fail, that you have the ability to learn from, because you're not too panicked, too anxious, too damaged, to whatever it is. Technically, in terms of stimulus, yes, all failure is feedback. If you fall off a cliff, the feedback is likely to be terminal. If it isn't, you will probably never do it again if you can possibly help it. So there is a lesson in that. And I think that one of the things that we've become very good at is ignoring failure and just repeating things, because we find comfort in the certainty of doing stuff, the certainty of what we know. And that kind of ties back into it. So failure is very important, and you can pull in things like, survivor bias and where we perceive failure to actually be versus where it actually is. But I think that those are very important things to kind of at least be aware of when you're making decisions and taking actions.
So you use the example of falling off the cliff, and sometimes it is terminal. So one of the things that always amazes me is when I read those stories about the surfers that, actually get a limb bitten off, a leg or an arm or a hand or something, shark attacks. But then they are back at the surfboard and they go surfing again. So you think, well, maybe these people should have learned. But then you realize that they can overcome diversity, and they better themselves. So they kind of overcome the fall from the cliff. They overcome the shark bite, and they better themselves. So the feedback, perhaps it wasn't too terminal at this example, but we as people, I think it's important that you highlight this so well in terms of learning from the failures and learning, being exposed, exploring with an open mind. And I think this is looking through your work. I think it's something beautiful that you do. I think you inspire others as you do that. So I want to go back to your TEDx talk again. So you say collaboration is so important to define our success. So from failure to success, and that requires collaboration, right? So why is it that we usually don't do a very good job at collaborating? So can you give us a few suggestions on how to collaborate better?
So I think one of the reasons we don't always collaborate very well is because we're quite a strange species, I guess. We excel at creating social structures. We kind of automatically form tribes and all of these kind of things. So we have this inclusiveness about us. And at the same time, we have this exclusiveness about us. I mean, in a lot of ways, tribes, especially traditional tribes, are very exclusive as well as inclusive, probably for a number of evolutionary reasons, in terms of things like, you have to be able to find excuses to kill other human beings who are competing for the same resources and all of that kind of thing. But collaboration is something that is also natural to us. we excel at kind of change and doing things singly, and we also excel at comfort, and we excel at doing things together. I think that the greatest things that we've achieved have come from doing things together. There is only so much single humans can do, and very often a single human doesn't have the ability to make proper decisions on their own. We do work from a kind of much better basis as in communities. But the collaboration of everything for me comes down to learning and human engagement. Because when you collaboratively learn, I mean, you can learn things very well on your own or not. But when you collaboratively learn something, there's an extra dimension there. Other people will ask the questions that you did not know that you had, which helps you learn much better. So, collaboration, I think, is a really important thing for us to achieve greater things. But it also means that everyone is invested in the outcome. So it's not really the same as alignment. It's not the same as lots of people doing the same thing, learning themselves and, doing things on their own in the same direction. Everyone's invested in the outcome. And that means that everyone is more likely to put the energy and effort in to make it a success.
That's a very important aspect of the work you do, the work that Zhen does, and the work of many of us do, which is co-creating of reality. So not one side imposing a voice into others, so not one side determining what it is, but us as a group, as a people, getting together and building or co-constructing that reality together. I think it's important. And thank you for highlighting that. I wanted to go back to something that you said, and both you and Jim were exposed. And you pardon my Welsh if I don't say it right, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the Cunningham framework, right? So it seems that Snowden himself, the creator, said, this is the place of multiple belongings, referring to culture, religion, and a variety of other archetypes that actually influence who we are, right? So can you explain the model? How do you use it?
I think one of the most important ways that I use Cynefin, kind of as a mix of them, I use it, or I see it mostly as a lens. I know it gets referred to as a model, as a framework. Dave often refers to it as a framework. For me, it's a lens. It's how I look at things. So number one, it's very important to me to establish context. We spoke about context earlier. I know Jen mentioned it. Context, people laugh because at some point I always say it depends on the context. That's a very me thing to say, but it is true. You need to operate based upon your context. And so the first thing is to see where you are, because that kind of lets you know how you can move forward, how you can manage the situation, how you can manage things. And from there, you can then look at things like sense making. You can look at safe to fail probes, where you can experiment to find better or new pathways forward, which is often what's called managing serendipity. So finding kind of this segues into survival of the luckiest and various other things. But for me, it's a lens with which to view the world. And for me, it's actually been not just for my work, which is very helpful, because a corporation, for example, when I'm doing executive coaching or whatever, people are people. So however ordered, linear, causal your work may be, adding people into the mix invariably, I don't want to say breaks it, but disrupts it, because people are not machines with fine tolerances. We are very, very different. We're all complex. We work on a complex basis, and our interactions are very complex and entangled as well. So I think for me, it then becomes very important to take that into account. But for me, it was a really kind of, excuse me, it was an epiphany when I found Cynefin through a very good friend of mine called Liz Keogh, because it's how I've always worked, like consciously. I've always worked in a very complex, aware way, and I never knew I was doing it. And I never knew why I didn't fit into the way everyone else did things, which isn't necessarily in that way. So it's become very important to me personally, but it's also become very important to me for dowsing where companies are, dowsing where to explore things. And that's kind of, it's a very integral part of my life now.
Wonderful. So I want to go back to definitions. So far we talked about sense making, speculative fabulation, right? So what is speculative fiction?
Oh, speculative fiction. I think this can be quite a subjective thing. So when we're looking at fiction, we're looking at, in essence, the non-real. And within that, we often take fantasy and science fiction and horror and romance and whatever else we have in there. Speculative fiction is kind of almost an overarching genre, which kind of combines them. So where some fiction may be very much based in, for example, the Wild West, speculative fiction allows you to push those boundaries that Zhen was talking about. And it's interesting that it's not necessarily just pushing those boundaries. I think fiction and fabulation both have this in common, that there's also perhaps the making of boundaries a little more permeable. So with fiction, the advantage is you're not going to disrupt your current world quite as much. So you can actually hybridize stuff. So you get things in eventually like steampunk, which is very Wild West and very steam oriented and whatever, and they become genres in their own right, which can have some fantastic stories. For me, fiction, it doesn't matter where you write a story, and it can be non-fiction, it can be fiction, it can be fantasy, it can be sci-fi, it can be literally anything. It's not so much about the world. So the world building is an important part, but I really love the idea of the reworlding that Jen was talking about, because in a way, the world building within fiction and speculative fiction, it's critical, but I do not consider it to be the most important part. It is the characters and the characters who drive the story and experience the story and the arcs that are at least as important as that. They have to do it somewhere. That's why world building is really important. But more than that, you then have kind of the third part, which is the flow, which is why I feel it's very much like music a lot of the time. You have to flow through concepts and maintain a cadence and build upon that. So you get this crescendo. Again, there is an element of music to it. So I think that they're all quite important, but speculative fiction for me is the pushing of the impossible, the possible, the plausible. It's kind of a mixture of all of those. I think it's quite subjective.
Okay, so now I'm gonna do the alphabet soup again with you. Okay, so as a follow-up to that, so let's say I'm trying to create an immersive world. Okay, and there are a couple of approaches, right? So can you explain to me how would you define fantasy, science fiction, and speculative fiction? So and you write on all three of them, right? So aren't they all in a sense just pure speculation? So why do you write in all three?
Well, are they all speculation? I mean, this is one of the interesting things. What we used to call speculative fiction and science fiction, and you and Jen both touched on this again, in terms of nuclear fusion, for example, it's a dynamic application of taxonomy, really, because fusion was very much science fiction, and it was very much speculative fiction, because we knew it was a process that could happen, but we had no idea how to make it happen or if we could make it happen. And it's now becoming a reality. Does that mean that what was written before is no longer speculative fiction? Does it mean it is still fiction? Do we reclassify these things? So it's an interesting shifting boundary, I think. For me, fantasy has an association with non-technological or predominantly non-technological, maybe feudal cultures, worlds, environments, where people very often use the unknown. So I think it was Clarke's quote, wasn't it? Any technology that's sufficiently advanced will appear to be like magic. Well, the magic essentially that we still yearn for, that we still try to create. And I think that, going back to things that were being said in terms of meaning, that we're really trying to find meaning, and that's why we create stories, and that's why we create fiction, from things where there are gaps. So it's an incomplete understanding of something that gives rise to gaps that we can then fill with stories. If we know everything about something, we don't usually attribute myths and legends and fictions and whatever to it. But fantasy for me tends to be that kind of more primitive is the wrong word, but not technologically based. Whereas sci-fi, especially hard sci-fi, tends to be more based in the real world almost, with what could be possible, or what is possible, or what might be possible, and that kind of thing. Softer sci-fi kind of bridges the gap, actually, I think sci-fi really is a type of fantasy. And I think speculative fiction goes over the top of all of them. I think it's the speculation of what could be, whether it's possible or not.
Wonderful. So one of the reasons why I do this is I really like people to think about, and so people are very quick to discount, well, fantasy is not serious or science fiction is not serious, but indeed, they do serve a purpose. And people should pay attention. Those are important methodologies and important tools. So I want to go and explore one of your other quotes that I really found very interesting. And you said, in speculative fiction, a mirror tends to be held up to our own world, right? So to what extent should we view even your fantasy books, you have plenty of them, right, as a way to reflect or to confront our own reality?
I quite deliberately use my books to challenge tropes, to introduce or induce familiarity with things. I mean, that's one of the ways you draw people in and get them to want to understand what you're saying. But you also have to have that novelty, that the familiar and the non-familiar that draws people in. So yes, I use my books as a mirror for things. I mean, I like to play with things. So, for example, there's a culture called Moorland. They're about 10,000 years old. They're almost like ancient China in some ways, without having, stagnated and so forth. And they actually live very simple lives, and they view all of the other cultures as very young and very foolish and learning their way. And they are, a predominantly black culture. And so I like to take things that aren't here, that could have been, and explore those. But also I think that there's this difference between the fabulation and the fiction there. If you're holding up a mirror to what we do and why, you've got the fabulation side, which is maybe more of a living application. Again, that reworlding, I think, was a really nice way to put it. So I like to explore things, in terms of cultures and what could be through my fiction in that way, and hold a mirror up to things we're doing wrong, things we could do, but also take things bigger than humanity. I think so one of the other quotes that people, I'm sure Jen's heard me say it before, but it's hard to navigate when you're too close to the sun. You need that outside context, and humanity is very close to its own sun or suns. We don't really have anyone to give us outside context, barring an alien race dropping in and saying, what are you doing with all this stuff, or something like that. So it's a way to kind of explore the things that are bigger than humanity, and why we're not looking at them, why we are looking at other things.
I think one of the important features of your work is that, the concept of the mirror. So even, your fantasy books, you are asking us to confront reality. So we are not just looking, at dragons and things like that, cape and sword for the sake of it, but rather with a reason. And I like the fact that you use fantasy and other genres to help us think about reality and how we confront reality, or how we think about reality. And because we call fantasy or sci-fi or fabulation, our defenses are lowered, and we allow ourselves the liberties to explore, because it is pure fantasy, but there's a function in society and in literature for fantasy, for sci-fi. There's a follow-up comment or question here that, and we're going to go back to the alphabet soup a little bit. So Haftiz asks, so at what point does speculative fiction emerge into reality and then move into fabulation. So fiction, reality, fabulation, the alphabet soup.
It's an interesting question. I mean, so in some ways, for me, that my speculative fiction, and I can't speak for other authors, is also in a way fabulation, because I take, and that's very specific to me, because a lot of my fiction comes from the wonder of the world as it is, and all I do is tweak it slightly or explore it slightly. I do also have enormous amounts of fun randomly making stuff up, or writing about dreams that I've had, which are sometimes quite, interesting. But where do they cross over? I think that may change depending on what they are. So speculative fiction may emerge into reality over time as things that were, and this is an interesting thing when you look at things like Star Trek, for example, which kind of pioneered the idea of tablets. So Geordie LaForge is always on his tablet and whatever. And okay, granted, we kind of had tablets in the 90s, but they weren't Star Trek tablets by any means. And then came the iPad, and suddenly you wonder if art had imitated life in some way, or life had imitated art. So that's quite an interesting kind of crossover. So I think things, depending on what they are, depending on where they are, depending on how speculative they are, they can move into reality relatively quickly. And then where do they move into the fabulation? Well, that, I think that the fabulation is this ongoing process, like Zhen was saying, this navigation. Navigation to me is a very core word, but I actually look at it in terms of tautai, which is a Samoan word, which basically means navigator, but it means a lot more than that. It's this holistic viewpoint of the world, where you use tools, you use maps to start, but then you're moving whole cultures between shores, which is why I called this my company Finding Shores, based upon song and story and the movement of the waves and the marine life and the color of the clouds to denote whether there was land. And all of these kind of things bind in this very kind of holistic approach. And every time I say holistic near Dave, obviously from Cognitive Edge, he gives me a slap, but I'm using it here nonetheless. And that comes back to that pattern matching. So, speculative fiction can almost be a generative, innovative space where we can sandbox anything and everything. And we may then find that there are patterns we can apply to reality. And then perhaps the fabulation is the evolving and the linking of those patterns as we move forward on a continual basis. So what I was thinking of in terms of sense making when Zhen was talking about that was it's not just a journey, but it's also binding in the purpose when you're looking at sense making, making sense of the world around you. So I don't think it's a linear stream like that necessarily. It might be. I'd need to think about it, but hopefully that made some sense.
Well, we're all into sense making, so we need to explore and beat around the bush, I guess, a little bit before we can make sense of things, right? So I want to ask you for advice. The next question is about advice. So in your view, what are the good requirements of a good story? I mean, you're a fantastic storyteller, right? And what advice would you give to those in the audience who are curious about creating their own immersive worlds, but they're not so sure how to go about it? So how do you create so many worlds?
How do I create so many worlds? It's a mixture of ideas I've had, inspirations I've had, things I've seen, and then they either speak to me and say, you should repeat these in a way that other people can understand. So stories are actually an integral part of teaching. For me, it's a way of relating things so that other people not only can understand, but are drawn in. So one of the things is having relatable characters in whatever world you create. Having a character that people either strongly relate to as people or can put themselves into, so that they are essentially experiencing what is happening, is a very good way to start immersing people. So it's not enough to interest them. You have to immerse them in what's going on and then involve them in what's going on. So there's that inspirational kind of element. as I said, dreams occasionally. Like one of the demons in one of my books was this horrible Lovecraftian thing. In my head, I spent an evening cowering in a stream next to it while it devoured a village. Wasn't a particularly pleasant dream, and made a very interesting kind of counterpoint for one of the books. And of course, because it's fantasy, you can do that kind of thing, right? So I found that was quite interesting. But building these worlds, it depends to what level you wish to go. This is a bit of an autistic thing for me. I need it to be living and breathing. So for me, if you are going to create something like this, think of it like a canvas. If you can paint on anything, but the texture of what you painted on will shine through. So if you paint on canvas, that's your backstory, that's the world you're creating, and you paint the story on top, and the texture of the world will then show through what you're doing. But the world can be anything, and it's up to you how much detail you want to go to at times, but excessiveness is occasionally part of my nature. So
Well, it's okay. It's okay to have excess in creativity. It's not a sin, I guess. So I couldn't really let you go without asking you about neurodiversity, and something that you make a point throughout the interview and in your writings. And you say autism allows you to see links and find connections and patterns that otherwise, people usually miss. So in a sense, you highlight the positives. Our societies usually highlight the negatives or deficiencies, and we often do not embrace or allow for autistic voices themselves to be heard. So, in your perspective, what could we do, or how should we change in order to bring more autistic voices to the debate?
I think this is really important because it's now thought that probably a great percentage of the people who have changed the course of human history in a very significant way, certainly at an individual level, have probably had neurodiverse or even autistic traits. Because you get the idea to process things differently, to hyper focus where other people wouldn't necessarily do that. So I think that part of the inclusiveness there is to understand that society, what I have, and I never knew this until I was diagnosed. I just thought that everyone couldn't cope with stuff the way I couldn't cope with it. And what I have is a disability, and it's a learning disability, not because I have trouble learning. I'm an incredibly fast learner, but because the way that we are taught to learn, the way that society is structured, the way that things are focused on and perceived, and everything else is not set up to allow for different ways of thinking. And I've now found out that my brain is literally wired differently, but it goes even deeper than that. So that's one level of awareness. Um, I feel emotion and my senses 3 to 5 times more intensely than other people. And I have synesthesia. I interpret my senses differently. I get overloaded sometimes by them. So it's that understanding that it's very easy for us to become entitled, especially in the West here, because after a certain level of privilege, you just believe that everyone is the same as you. And of course, that is not the case at all. The world is extremely diverse. So that level of understanding that people are different, and that different doesn't mean worse, wrong, better, whatever. I had a reading age of 21 when I was 12, which sounds great. I also have dyscalculia, so I'm not particularly good with numbers. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And that's the core part of the message here, is that we actually need to go back to this more human approach and say, we're not components, we're not just pieces that plug into something. All of us have individual strengths and weaknesses which can be utilized by companies, by ourselves, and the outliers, the mavericks, the heretics, the people who are me, and many of us, especially in the coaching community where we don't necessarily fit into corporate structures, those should be recognized and utilized. And it's more about fit and the potential for fit than it is about hard skills, than it is about ACV, than it is about, kind of the more numerical application of fit in that way. So it's that more individual thing of where can we fit, what skills do we have, and how can we benefit ourselves and others. So that kind of awareness is really, really important. And you get incredible results, especially with autistic people. If you allow for that, you get some incredible results.
That's the beautiful thing of including other voices, is because we see the world differently, and we all learn from each other. Now, I want to bring Jen. I did not forget about a question here, and probably, Jen, I'm going to start with you because I had a little bit more time to think about it. You all talked about the same kind of thoughts. We create the tribes, and maybe we live within the tribes, and we don't perceive the world differently. We only think of the world for ourselves. Or maybe your example of the pinches. What if we thought about the world, if the pinches would like the world to be right? So in your perspective, the contributions that fabulation or speculative fiction or sense making, the contribution we could give to answer the question that Kai is posing. So how can we get to a global consciousness that cares not just about you and I, but all living things?
Uh, I'm going to be a little controversial and
That's
say that
okay.
maybe we don't. I say this because what we also know is that if you care about everything, you care about nothing. And because we've talked about the importance of diversity, because we've talked about the importance of accepting difference, I think that a global consciousness is really about multiple diversities of consciousnesses, right? I'm being deliberate about that, and accepting that we need that. I think, though, to sort of speak to Kai's point, is we do need um, greater awareness, greater compassion, greater knowledge, or consciousness of the connectedness and interrelatedness between things. That, I think, is critical. The this appreciation that life is about interrelatedness, about interdependencies, and, to borrow the term that Dave hates, a holisticness about it, right? We need to be embracing of that, embracing of diversity, embracing of the fact that people should care about different things. You have, for example, take a very random example. You've got rhinoceros associations and preservation. You also have elephant associations and preservations, and you need them all. But we also need that awareness, and we need that coordination across the ecosystem. So I think it's really about this broader ecosystem awareness that we need to cultivate, and about this stronger sort of sense of connectedness that we really need to perhaps encourage. So it's seeing things as a part of a whole, as opposed to different parts of something that you can take together and put back together again, because we know that life isn't like that, the world isn't like that. But people are going to care about different things, and we need to appreciate that, and appreciate that they're doing something for the ecosystem as well.
How about you, Chris? What's your view on the question?
I mean, Jen basically covered a lot of the things that I was going to say. I think that the first thing that struck me there was, it's interesting that you used the consciousness and care, because they are slightly different. I mean, the consciousness is a cognitive kind of aspect in a lot of ways for us in how we live in society, whereas the care is kind of more affective, like it's an emotional kind of part of that. And you've got that compassion, that empathy, the ability to understand. And I think that cultivating that is important, but it really comes down to, pretty much as Jen said, that an awareness rather than an individual care, because we only have so much energy, each of us, realistically. And if you care about everything, and this is one of the problems for me, actually, being autistic, I care about too many things too much, and it drains me to the point where I can't always function. it is easy for anyone to get to that point if you start looking at things over the top. There's a very interesting concept called Sonder, Sonder. And, I get hit with it when I go to cities, which is why I don't commute into cities if I can help it, where you become very aware, and you can't stop being aware of the intricacies of detail of everyone around you as an intricate individual human, exactly the same as you, living, laughing, loving, crying, dying, everything that you do. And it's overwhelming. Like, you can't think like that in a city of millions of people. It's just impossible. And so, I've explored things like this, funnily enough, in some of my books, because I think it's interesting. But for me, it's more about that awareness, number one, but also it's more about maybe the ideas of kind of equity in the hearing of all voices. And the reason I phrase it like that is because we often talk, this kind of almost goes back to some of the Confucianism we were talking about, where harmony is an interesting thing. But realistically, harmony is a blend of different voices rather than all voices in complete unison. And so I think that's really important as well. We talked, we heard about the compassion, the interdependency. I think that the connections are as important as agents in the system. So an overall awareness that this is an ecosystem, we're all part of it, we all have our place. We can't see anything. And I always go to diving analogies because I'm a diver. You can't see everything. You have visibility levels. You can see vague shapes. The further away they are, the bigger they are, you can still see them. But what you really focus on is here, but you're still part of a greater ecosystem and you're aware of it. And I think that that's an important part of it.
Well, I guess I would have a boatload more questions to ask of both of you, but I'm afraid I can't ask for more of your time. This was such a wonderful talk. Thank you, Zhen. Thank you, Chris. I really hope to see you again soon, very soon. Well, not so fast. So Chris is going to be back. We're going to interview him at Books and Authors, and he's going to talk about two of his new releases, The Serpent Calls and Tides of Chaos. So if you really want to hear more about his books, that's going to be the place to be. Two new releases this year, so more interesting things. So again, we're going to use his fantasy to confront the world and helping us deal with chaos. So we're not very good at dealing with chaos. So again, his stuff is online, and you can find it on Amazon.com. And again, please come back and let's hear from him again on not just to involve me, which is a part of education, but also his fantasy books and the two new ones. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. So by the way, feel free to continue to submit your comments and your questions on our YouTube page. I make sure to read them and present the guests with any other questions or comments you might have. If you're listening to us via podcast or watching the show as a recording, you can be part of the conversation as well. Again, just go to our YouTube channel, leave a comment or a question, and we'll get to that. So it's really time for us to start saying our goodbyes. I want to highlight some of the upcoming events. So Manny Tiram and Dr. Maria Hoffaker will be here in the show to talk to us. We have Eugene Ivanov, a fantastic author. We're going to explore, some of his work as well. We'll continue to focus on the three topics you guys want to hear the most. So technology, how we deal with technology, and the metaverse. So you're talking about immersive worlds. This one is totally immersive. And sustainability. Two very big events. Two from Frost and Sullivan, one about innovation, and then Institute of Competitive Intelligence with a new event, the spring section. So lots of interesting things. Again, I want to take a little bit of time to thank you again. First, Zhen and Chris, for being here, sharing your thoughts and your perspectives, and bringing some clarity on those topics, and helping us understand how to use speculative fabulation, speculative fiction to confront our problems, to help us think about realities, help us deconstruct the realities and think about different worlds and how to get from here to there. So again, you guys, thank you so much. Today we had people from every continent except the penguins. The penguins did not dial in, so I'll probably go after them and complain. So you can get back with me, the host, or the magazine through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I want again to thank you so much for being here with Zhen, Chris, and I. I will leave you with our institutional message. Thank you.